Welcome, I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. Do you have your pen? Do you have your notepad? If not, pause the video now and grab that right now, because I want you to make a commitment to me, to yourself, that you will jot down some notes. You will jot down some sort of action item that you can implement in your business today. That's what it's all about. We need to implement something today. Let's take action today and drive your business forward. Now, today, I want to speak to you about competition. How do you feel about that? You hear the word competition. I want to talk to you about the market in which you operate and those businesses with whom you are competing. I'm not sure how you feel about this. Do you focus on your competition? Should you focus on your competition? Is that healthy or unhealthy? Do you resent your competition or do you embrace your competition? You know, there's a lot of different attitudes, and I suppose that is framed by and molded by the experience you have with your competition. Maybe you have competition that you barely notice and they are operating with great scruples, and you may also have competitors, some of you, that are operating without scruples and they are doing things that you may question the morality of, the ethics of, and they may be driving you nuts. So let's look at competition. Today we'll spend a little bit of time, giving you an idea, sort of a tool through which you can evaluate your competitive landscape, and then we'll take a look at some tips of how you can use the information that you glean from taking this analysis of your competitive landscape. So let's start with the tool, and that is something known as Porter's 5 forces. Now, this is in no way associated with Mia Wallace's Fox Force 5, nor the Fantastic Four, X-Men, nor the Avengers. I know it sort of sounds like maybe a superhero related type thing, but in fact, what the Porter's 5 forces are, the 5 forces that shape competition. This is a tool, and it's an analysis tool created by a guy named Michael E. Porter of Harvard Business School. And it's a very useful tool to describe your competitive landscape, to assess it, and then with that intelligence, you can make decisions, you can evaluate, and you can become more effective as a manager. And as the name would suggest, there's 5 forces involved in this tool and this evaluation method. And the first one we're going to look at is competitive rivalry, or rivalry within your industry and market. So for this, you want to consider, who is your competition? Who are your competitors? And I want you to think first and foremost, maybe a good exercise for you to do some homework today is to make a list and sort of brainstorm all your competitors. And start with your direct competitors, those who operate in your industry and your market. Your market being geographically, they compete with you in the same regions in which you operate. Some of you may compete globally and others are just operating in a local market. And when you're using this tool to evaluate your competitive landscape, then of course you want to eliminate and not become preoccupied with, similar businesses that operate in different markets, unless you intend to expand into those markets, and then you can include those in your evaluation. So the competitive rivalry within your industry and market. And start by making a list of all your direct competition and then expand that to indirect competition. What I mean by that is, think of those businesses that directly compete with you, that are essentially doing what you do. They operate in the same industry, their products or services are very, very similar to yours. And then as you expand that, this is a spectrum. When we talk about direct competition to indirect competition, you can think of indirect competition as maybe other industries within the same market who compete for those dollars, because there is a nature to how consumers engage in the market, and they may choose somebody that you don't think of as your competitor and engage with them and that is where they spend their money instead of with you. So let's use an example. I think for me, the one that comes to mind is tourism. You can appreciate that. Let's say you were operating a business in Paradise Island, somewhere in Hawaii, and you can appreciate that tourism is very competitive, because when people save up to go on holidays, there's a lot of different businesses competing for that tourist dollar. Of course, there is maybe the resort, the hotel, and you might choose when you're planning your family vacation to save a little bit on your accommodations in terms of your resort or your hotel, or you might step up and go to the 5-star, the Fairmont, or the Ritz-Carlton, these types of things. And so I just gave you an example of some direct competitors, the Waldorf Astoria versus the Fairmont. At least on Maui, they operate very close to one another, the Grand Wailea, and that's the Waldorf Astoria that's close to the Fairmont there. And those are direct competitors. But when you were planning your family vacation, you may have decided to stay in a less expensive hotel, and then some of that money you were going to spend on activities. And so you could see where that now in tourism, it's still the tourism industry, but now something outside of accommodations, outside of the resort is competing. So maybe you're deciding that you're going to spend more money on restaurants because you like to eat out and have very expensive meals, as opposed to spend it all on a room that you're not going to be in because you're enjoying the sunshine and so on. So the restaurant and the hotel, those are similar industries. They're not direct competitors. They become more indirect. And then you might start to think of, well, what about water activities? Are you going to go snorkeling? Are you going to go scuba diving? Are you going to go sailing? Are you going to rent some sort of aquatic entertainment? Are you going to take surfing lessons? These are all examples of things competing for the same tourist dollar, but they're not direct competitors. Some of those things, a direct competitor in terms of a water sport, you might decide you're going to go on a fishing excursion, and there's Bob's fishing excursion, and then there's Sam's full day fishing outings or whatever. Those are direct competitors. And then somebody suggests, oh, why don't we go diving, a night dive with the manta rays? And it's like, instead of fishing. Well, that becomes an indirect competitor along the spectrum. And again, a surfing lesson might, or paddle boarding, this would be indirect. But you can kind of get the idea. When you're thinking about your business, start to brainstorm who are your direct competitors, those that do very similar to what you do, and then start to think about what are the indirect competitors. And you'll get an idea for the rivalry within your industry and in your market, the competitive rivalry. And that's the first force in the 5 forces, in Porter's 5 forces. And then the other thing you can start to do on this little list that you're going to do on your homework assignment is you can consider the 2 threats. There are 2 threats out of the 5 forces. 2 of them are threats. The first threat is threat of new entrants. So these are new entries into the competitive landscape. So that is a threat to your business. Maybe you're going to have a direct competitor who starts up and has a new business doing very similar to what you do, and now they're competing with you. And when you're considering whether or not that is a realistic threat for you, or how strong a threat it is for you, you got to think of the barriers to entry for what it is you do. Some of you have really high barriers of entry. That is, there's a great deal perhaps of capital necessary to start your kind of business, and that might be one of the barriers of entry that prevents new entrants into the competitive landscape. Somebody considering investing in a business similar to yours might think, oh boy, there's an incumbent business or several of them that already compete in this market. For me to invest all that money, there's a high barrier of entry there that might dissuade them, and they might look somewhere else, or they might look to a different industry or something like that. So other barriers of entry that I can think of are franchises. You know, they don't just, I was involved in automotive franchise, and it's not just willy-nilly that they create another franchise. There are a finite number of franchises, and they're highly scrutinized, the franchisees, and also the markets, and whether there's an open point or not, and whether or not the franchisor, that being the OEM, the manufacturer of the vehicle in my example, is actually going to award a franchise. And then, of course, there's major capital requirements again. So you can see that there's lots of barriers of entry in that to new entrants in that example. Another one would be, say, government regulation or necessary. I'm thinking of licenses or something like that. So I think of casinos as a good example of it's a pretty high barrier of entry to having a gaming operation, and those are highly regulated by government, and you need special licenses. The other one would be if you're involved in some sort of regulated substance like alcohol, tobacco, but nowadays, at least in my market, marijuana. There's dispensaries now. These are highly regulated industries. And another one would be registries. In our area, these are privatized, and you can actually have a motor vehicles registration location, but you can't just start one up. It's not completely free market. There's a high barrier of entry. So consider your industry and what barriers of entry are there for new entrants, and that gives you an idea for how high the threat of new entrants in terms of competition is for you. A couple of other things you consider when you're thinking about the threat of new entrants as a competitive force that is in your competitive landscape would be the network effects. Generally, and what this means is that people tend to get more benefit from a business with more users. Or that is to say, if your business is the type of business that benefits from the economies of scale, where the more users you have, the more useful it is for your users. Examples of that would be the internet as a great example. I mean, back when there were early stages of the internet and there weren't that many users, the internet wasn't that useful. But now that more and more of the world, almost everywhere, the world is has access to the internet, then more and more businesses are online, and the internet as a tool becomes that much more useful. That's a description of a network effect. Do you have network effects in your business? Because if you do, then that gives you a little bit of protection against the threat of new entrants, because another example would be Facebook. Is if you were starting a new social media company, and let's say, for example, Facebook had the network effects, everybody was involved in Facebook, then if you had something very, very similar to Facebook, the chances of you being a threat to Facebook are much lower, because if somebody switched over to Facebook and they were all by themselves over there and nobody else had joined, the customer on the new Facebook 2 or whatever is, you know, not getting any benefit and is likely to go right back to Facebook where all the friends and family are. That's another example of network effects. Another one you should consider is the cost of switching. Do your customers have to pay a lot to switch providers? And, you know, typically with small and medium-sized businesses, that's not the case. Your customers could easily, if you had a small retail location and a customer decided they were not going to shop at your store, they were going to shop at your nearest competitor, there's very little cost to switching. But maybe you have a brick and mortar store, you operate in a small market, and for your customers to switch, they have to drive an hour or 2 hours to get to the nearest competitor. That's a high cost of switching. So you have you get a bit of a competitive moat created by your geographical location. Location. That's another thing that can give you a competitive moat or advantage and mitigate against the threat of new entrants. So give some thought to those things as you're taking this little exercise. So far we've talked about the competitive rivalry and those businesses that are competing for the same dollars from your market, from your consumers, from your customers. Then we talked about the threat of new entrants. The second threat is the threat of substitutes or the threat of substitution. Do you market a product or service that can easily be substituted? And think of substitution as something that a person can solve a similar need with a different technology. So if you think of it from that definition, then that'll help you to determine whether or not this is a new entrant that you're worried about, or this is actually a substitution. So these are things that maybe are indirect competitors, and somebody is going to decide they're going to spend their money on that indirect competitor instead of your product or service. They're going to substitute. So an example I can think of is maybe you are a rancher who is producing the highest quality grass-fed beef, and then you might think of a substitute as somebody who's going to spend their money on more seafood or pasture-raised pork, or they're going to eat more free-range chickens or something like that. So those are examples of substitutions. And think of this, and when you're doing your little exercise, your homework here, write down the threat of substitutions and who are those substitutes. What are those products that may substitute for yours? So now we've covered the competitive rivalry within your industry and market and the two threats. Now there's two powers that Porter describes in his 5 forces of competition and shaping competition. The first power is the power of suppliers, supplier powers, or the bargaining and negotiating power of those vendors that sell to you, that keep you in business. Do you have lots of places that you can get your raw materials? So I'm not sure if you are selling time inventory and human labor, and maybe you're operating in a market where human labor is really easy to come by. I've operated both in markets where it's really difficult to hire people and recruit people. I've operated in markets where it's much easier, and there's a lot of applicants for every job. So that's one example of a supply that you need for your business. But think also of raw materials, or maybe you're just reselling. You are retailing something, you're getting that from a wholesaler. If there's only one supplier for you, or the fewer, we should say, the fewer suppliers there are, the more power that those suppliers have to you, because there'll be other people trying to buy from them as well. And they don't have a lot of competition from which you can choose to get your raw materials, your products, in order to be able to provide your products and services to your end consumer. And so you have a greater threat of competition when the power of your suppliers is higher. So you can assess that for your own industry, and when you think of it and you go, actually, I have lots of options. So I can get my raw materials, I can get my necessary things to run my business from a whole variety of sources globally, and they are very competitive with one another, then you have the leverage in that case. So the vendor or the supplier power is low, and that is less of a force of competition acting against your business. The other power is the bargaining power, the power of your consumers, and that speaks to how many options they have to get something very similar to you, what you offer. You can see how these concepts are integrated and closely related, but think of the power of consumers and how it impacts your business to be what sort of pool of customers are you working with? Some of you operate businesses where you do very high value contracts with very few customers, while others are operating and you are selling very low priced items to many, many customers. You have many customers. The latter has less power from the consumer. That is to say that you have less of a competitive force acting against your business by the power of consumers when you have a huge pool of customers that you're dealing with, as opposed to the former example where you have very few customers you're dealing with. Those consumers you are dealing with have more power in your business to negotiate price and so on. So in order to drive the power for consumers down and to have less of a competitive threat in that way, you want to think about in what ways can you distribute or decentralize how many customers you have and your sources of revenue. And there are all sorts of ways we can talk about doing it, but what I want you to do, because we only have a finite amount of time today we're going to spend on this, is you to explore those ideas and think, should I be taking on, say 10 $1,000 contracts to earn $10,000 in revenue versus one $10,000? If you have to dedicate your resources and you have a finite number of resources and your ability to scale your business is not infinite, you may want to make these kinds of decisions. So you can see how this tool, as we talk about these different things and you explore them, it gives you this idea of your competitive landscape and those forces, competitive forces that are acting for or against your business, generally against your business, and you can start to strategize and manage to see how you can mitigate against those things. So just one more time, just to recap, you've got your rivalry in the market and industry. That is your competitive landscape. Kind of take a look at all of the competitors with whom you compete for your customer's dollar. And then you think of the two threats and the two powers. The two threats are the threats of new entrants into your market, into your industry, and the threat of substitution from your product to something similar that is operated by a slightly different technology, and the two powers being the power of your suppliers and the power of your customers. Give some thought to that as you go through this tool, this Porter's 5 forces that shape competition, and think about how this operates for you. And this will become a really good place for you, to generate some ideas. And now let's talk a little bit about how should you feel about competition. I asked you at the beginning of the video, do you cringe at the thought of competition? Do you embrace your competition? Or how do you feel about it? And I think there's no doubt we would all sort of like to operate in a monopoly. It would be nice to have a monopoly. A monopoly would be great for your business. In fact, Peter Thiel talks about how, that's essentially what your aspiration is when you're starting a business. He has a book called 0 to 1, and in that he describes that competitive advantage and the landscape that you want by having this order of magnitude better value than your competition. And essentially your effort is to try to create a monopoly. Now we have this experience where we hear about governments breaking up monopolies, and of course monopolies are not good for the consumer, but I'm here to tell you that they aren't necessarily entirely good for you, or that is to say competition is not entirely bad for you. But I can agree with you that it would be nice to operate with as little competition as possible, as long as you could somehow try to get the benefits that competition offers you in its absence. And that's where people become complacent. So let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits competition, because almost none of you operate in a low competitive market. I would say that most of my viewers are operating in a very competitive industry and market. So let's look at what are the benefits of your competition. The first one that comes to mind for me is that you can learn from your competition and you can adopt those ideas from your competition that translate easily from one business to another. So to the degree that your competitor has an idea that you're not employing to add value to your products or services, and you could be, then you can do that and you can get these ideas. You can think of it as sort of decentralizing the idea generation among those people who operate similar businesses to yours. We used to always say that any competitive advantage you have has a shelf life. That is to say, competitive advantages are fleeting. So if you came up with this epiphany for your business and you were going to improve the value and attract more customers to your business by offering a little bit more convenience or improving your customer experience in some way, you can think of that as having a shelf life, because eventually your competitors are going to catch on to that. They're going to learn from your customers, or just through osmosis, so to speak, what is going on. And to the extent that this is not something proprietary that is really protected by trade secret or even patented, then they're going to just copy it. And those many of your ideas for innovation and improving value are going to be fleeting. They're only going to last for so long before the competition. But that's a two-way street. You get to take advantage of that as well. And so if you have a really skilled competitor, I know that kind of is disappointing because he may be eating into your market share, but he probably because he's skilled, he probably has lots of great ideas that can improve your business as well. And maybe you're competing against some lesser skilled competitors, and your strongest competitor, you're picking up on those ideas and adding it where the lesser skilled competitors are not adding it. So you're actually, along with this strong competitor, the two of you are gobbling up market share, and the other ones are more likely to go out of business. So that's one of the benefits I can think of. And you can also, another benefit is you can derive motivational force from your competition. You know, sometimes you just wake up and you think, well, let's do a sports analogy. I mean, competition is really powerful in terms of a motivational force for people to train really hard. They think of the competitor with whom they're going to be competing at the track meet or in the mixed martial arts match or whatever, and they find that they can derive this motivational force by focusing on their competitor, and or at least thinking about how strong their competition is, and that forces them to make themselves stronger. It's the same in the business environment, and you should, at least if you have to have competitors, try to use them to drive you in a way that you might otherwise be complacent. And again, as you go back to Porter's 5 forces and you're considering that and you're evaluating it, and maybe you get some anxiety or some fears arise by you're going through this and going, boy, there are a lot of people trying to compete for my livelihood. That can be very motivational. You know, it can kind of put that fire under your feet and give you the little kick in the butt that you need. Choose your metaphor. And I think competition serves very well for that. So to the degree that you've got to have competition, at least use it in whatever way it can drive you forward. In that regard, I would encourage you to embrace a spirit of competition. That's what we say. He's got a very competitive spirit. And you may describe yourself as, oh, I'm very competitive, maybe with your siblings, with your coworkers throughout your career, and now as an entrepreneur, as a manager, you've always been competitive. You want to win, you want to win. Well, if you had nobody competing against you, you'll always be looking for that competition. And I was an elite swimmer when I was a kid, and I really, from an early age, sort of had instilled in me this sense of competition, this spirit of competition. And I took that into my professional life and into business. So think of it in a healthy way, that you can have a healthy competition. I would always recommend that you operate ethically, legally responsible, operate within the law, operate with good morals, and make sure that you're doing things that are ethical at all times. But as long as you're covering those bases, then, it's all out war, so to speak. All is fair, and do what you can to win. It's all about winning, as Jack Welch's book is describing. A moment ago, I mentioned that governments break up and discourage monopolies, or they can be illegal. And the reason for that is because competition is good for consumers, and they can be good for your business as well, because the reason it's good for consumers is competition really drives innovation and has the effect of lowering prices. So without competition, we would all be spending more. So you can't sort of have contempt for your competition, but want that your suppliers have lots of competition so that you can have lower effect of supplier power in that Porter's 5 forces evaluation. So you can appreciate that by having more and more suppliers for you, available for you, your prices come down. Well, it's the same for your customers. And you want to drive your prices down. It's a good thing to drive your prices down. And I would say if your prices are always going up, that might be a harder industry to compete in. If for whatever reason, you always have to raise prices, it would be hard to keep loyal customers in that regard. So think about how your competition drives innovation, and how you notice that somebody who is competing for your customers is doing something a little better than you, then maybe you go out and you invest in that technology, in that new equipment. You start to train your staff better. You start to spend more time on recruiting better talent and all the various things that are necessary for you to become better. And that's a good thing. It feels really good inside, and you get that, you sort of leapfrog one another, and that's how innovation works. That's why, as a society, our standard of living keeps going up. It's because of competition in the free market. And if the government would stay out of it and let market forces dictate what happens, you entrepreneurs out there are always trying to offer better value to customers. And so when a competitor comes up in place, then the two of you continue to drive innovation and better value. And at the same time, prices tend to go down, and we all benefit from that. You benefit from that, the consumers benefit from that, society as a whole benefits from that. Of course, the flip side of that coin is that more competition tends to erode profit margin. And in that way, it's not such a good thing for you as a business owner. It's certainly bad for any entrepreneur who lacks a sufficient unique selling proposition. If you fail to differentiate yourself from the competition by innovating and adding more value, then obviously you can expect your profit margins to erode with more competition, with those stronger forces. That's why, again, it always comes back to value. What are you doing to improve your unique selling proposition, your unique value proposition, and how are you communicating that to your customer? Another great benefit of competition that I think is often overlooked is that competition can have an effect of bolstering awareness within an industry. So if you think of yourself as, you have something really innovative, really unique that you're going to offer the market, but nobody's ever heard of this. They don't even know that they need it. Well, it's incumbent upon you entirely to try to communicate this to the market and teach people that this is a product or service that they should desire. But when there's more competition offering that, then you sort of share that awareness building. There's people are going, the one that comes to mind for me is ride hailing, Uber and Lyft, and there's all these others that are coming into business as well. The very first time, before, they represent significant new entrant into the competitive market against taxis. But that aside, you made the very first guy to come out with it, that first Uber, you may have been a little bit reluctant to jump into that. And then you hear about Lyft comes out, and now there's more acceptance and more of the market starts to go that way. That's the best example I can think of off the top of my head. But there are other things that new competitors, or rather competition, not necessarily new competitors, competition can share and ease your burden, so to speak. Sometimes you're attracting I just mentioned you're attracting more customers, but you can be attracting more talent to a particular industry. And in my example of Uber and Lyft, before there was a gig economy, the gig economy, that comes from the musician, the terminology comes from that. But before the concept of the gig economy for driving and ride hailing came, it may have been difficult for Uber to attract drivers, but the more and more there's that network effect again, and you can sort of balance that out. You're attracting more of a pool of resources to an industry that might be difficult for one person to do. So think of your business, and you operate in a geographical location perhaps, and you have a very small pool of talent that are specialized in doing what you do, but a couple more competitors come in and your industry as a whole grows and gains attention within the market. And now more and more people start to think, maybe I should apply for a job within that industry. That sounds like something I could do. So you get the idea that these pools for customers and talent, also suppliers. That's another good one, is that sometimes there are types of businesses that go together and they put themselves in similar locations. You think of the concept of a shopping mall. That was the original idea, is that people didn't have to drive all over town to get what they wanted. They could go to the mall, and now, of course, it's very competitive. One store within the mall is competing with somebody next to them. However, they're creating this pool that they all benefit from. And that's what I mean by talking about the symbiotic relationship with competition. Think about that. And sometimes you can even strategize with the competition to try to create these pools and mutually benefit from it. Other times you might be the only one who's realizing this, and you have this positive outlook about competition, and you can actually create strategies like you can advertise for talent as one example, saying if you have done this job, you would also be interested in this one. And it's really difficult for me to give these examples and make them relevant for all the variety of businesses that are considering this, but I want you to think about what symbiotic relationship you might have with your competition by the fact that you're drawing attention to your products and services as a whole. Some of you have a low power of suppliers because of the fact that you have lots of competition. That means that your suppliers have lots of competition. So that's another symbiotic relationship. The more people that you compete with, the more likely that you are going to have a greater pool of suppliers from which you can choose. And the degree to which you do that better than your competition does, that you better negotiate, you better evaluate your suppliers from time to time, periodically look at that and create these relationships, again, you're going to come ahead. And these pools, I think in your homework today, start to think of that and ask yourself, are there some various things, maybe the infrastructure, like internet service provider, if there were multiple people that were marketing fiber optic internet off of a particular infrastructure that wasn't owned by, maybe it's government owned, or it's owned by one particular company who licenses it to other smaller businesses who are going to market the service of the internet. There's all sorts of infrastructure. Also R&D costs. You can kind of think of your research and development costs going down. When we talked about sort of stealing or copying ideas, that's sort of a way of decentralizing the idea of R&D. Maybe you are spending some money on coming up with some new ideas for your business. Some of them work and your competition might copy those. Some of them won't work and you were the one who invested all the money and it didn't work out. Well, that happens, again, it's a two-way street. It happens. You can observe what goes on at the competition and they are researching and developing new ways to add value to the competitive market, and you can observe and see, ooh, that didn't work. I'm glad I didn't go that way. And once again, the degree to which you can be a better, more effective manager in terms of evaluating how you're going to leverage your resources in R&D and make sure that you take the proper risks, you can do better than the competition, and yet you still get that symbiotic benefit. Another benefit I've seen over time is when the competition has limited capacity and you may do a better job of scaling your business and adding capacity, and you can pick up market share and you can conquest new customers from your competition. So a customer who's going to your competitor, it's not your customer, and then they find that to engage in that product or service is going to be a delay. There's back orders, or in order to book an appointment, to get a technician to come out is going to take much longer because that competitor is doing very, very well, but they're not scaling and you do a good job of scaling, then we call that overflow. So you get overflow customers from your competition. That's a great way to do it. And again, you pick up on a theme here. If you can do things, if you can manage more effectively than your competition, competition can be a great thing. They can be great feeders to your business, and customers that are sort of, they have customer attrition or customer defection from one of your competitors and they come over and you pick it up. I've seen certain industries where there are a few big players, maybe 3 or 4 big players, and it's like every time one of them loses a customer, another one picks it up, and you kind of go, well, they're competitive against one another, but it's really distributing the risk in a certain way as well. They don't have to, if you had control of the whole market, you have the risk of the whole market, and you have, again, to have that kind of monopoly might not serve you as well as you think. So think about what competitors do you have, and do you have any strategy in place to make sure that their customers know that you should be their first call if they are in any way dissatisfied with their current supplier, with their current provider of the products and services that you also offer. Make sure that you let people know, hey, we have capacity. We have delivery as available as soon as tomorrow. You can book appointments this week with us, and so on. People are transient. There isn't 100% loyalty to a brand. You need to be there. You need to manage your business well and be able to scale to pick up these overflow customers. Another one that might occur to you while we're going through this is the idea of associations, trade associations, and where competitors, they compete in the market together, but they form associations and get together, and maybe they lobby government and everything. I am against this, and I've paid my dues. I've belonged to a few associations like this in the past, but fundamentally it goes against what I believe in terms of market economy, a free market, and capitalism. I don't like crony capitalism. I don't like lobbying and the idea behind that, and even though I've been the benefactor of it. And so what I put in place when I relaunched this business, BMI, is we have something called VIPs group, which is the Vitality Index Peer Support Group. So there is a place that peers can get together, but we make sure they are not competitors by the definition we're discussing today. They either operate in different industries or they operate in markets that are far enough apart that they can be in the same industry or similar industries, but they're not directly competing with one another. And then you can put your heads together and you can get ideas and get synergy from one another. Then I completely believe in those associations. I just don't like it when they try to do rent seeking, or they set up situations in which they protect their industry by limiting the number of new entrants and competition. That's not good. I just don't believe in it. I like my chances of competing against anyone, and I hope you do as well. I hope you think in a fair, free market condition, you can compete very well. We've all had government regulation and things that went against our business, and when you dig deep, sometimes you find out, well, that's the result of lobbying. There's some sort of special interest group that is not allowing for a fair or even playing field to exist. So that is part of what happens in the competitive landscape. It's a reality. So think how it's affecting you, and how can you benefit from this? How can you mitigate against the risks of it? As is always the case, you got to focus on those things over which you have control. Don't spend any time in your circle of concern that is outside your circle of influence. It's just wasted time. And so it's the same when it comes to competition. So at the beginning when we said, should I focus on my competition? You can maybe don't focus on your competition. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it. You don't want to be blissfully ignorant of your competition. I guess in summary, the best way to look at it is you want to leverage your competition to the greatest degree possible to your benefit, while mitigating those things in those ways in which they detract or represent a threat to your business, all the while trying to build loyalty to your brand. And that's what this is all about. If you want to mitigate against the threat of competition, build loyalty to your brand. And people would say, boy, Michael, in this day and age, there's very little loyalty. I would say that loyalty is going down, and I think Peter Drucker described in his book, Management Revised, he said that all trends are, I'm not quoting directly here, but all the trends are indicating that consumer loyalty is diminishing, and any efforts attempting to reverse that will be in vain. And Peter Drucker, very smart guy, I got to follow that. But you just have to do it better than your competition. It may be that you're not going to reverse the trend of consumer loyalty diminishing, but you are going to have more loyal customers or customers that are more loyal to your brand than your competition has to its. So think about the ways you can do that. Once again, it all comes back to value. You've got to innovate. You've got to drive innovation in your business so that you can create greater value than the competition. I think that's where I want to leave it today. That was a lot to cover, but I hope you got something out of it. You've got a lot of homework to do, and I really encourage you to do this. Don't just dismiss this. If you've never done a competitive evaluation on your business, you've done one of those SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats. That's another way to look at this. I hope you'll give the Porter's 5 forces that shape competition a chance and use that tool, and consider some of the ways that I described that you can benefit from your competition, that you can get a little bit of a symbiotic relationship or use them to drive motivation for you and so on. Leave some comments there about what how competition has affected your business. Do you appreciate competition? Do you wish you had a monopoly? Leave some kind of comment that we can all learn from, because we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.